Welcome to True Bill Talk, a podcast about the realities of being a prosecutor, challenges in the field, and how we can make our criminal justice system work better for everyone. My name is Alyssa Mark-Hayderi, and I'm the director of the Vanderbilt Project on Prosecution Policy, also known as VPOPP, here at Vanderbilt Law School. When I left the Manhattan DA's office to work in the nonprofit and policy world, one prosecutor's name came up again and again in conversations about innovative, thoughtful approaches to justice: Sherry Boston. Sherry has served as the district attorney of DeKalb County, Georgia, home to about 800,000 people since 2017. But describing her just as a local DA doesn't capture her full impact. She's a national voice in prosecution reform. In addition to her work with us here at VPOPP, she's very active in organizations like her State DA's Association and the National Black Prosecutors Association. When she commits to trying a new policy in her office, she partners with researchers to see how effective it is. And she's the lead plaintiff in a major lawsuit challenging a controversial Georgia law that gives the state power to remove locally elected prosecutors. In short, Sherry goes far beyond the traditional bounds of her role. She's helping to shape the future of how prosecution works in Georgia and across the country. If you haven't heard of her, this episode is your chance to get to know her. And if you have met her, this in-depth conversation will give you a richer understanding of how her childhood shaped her worldview, how she thinks about her responsibility as a DA, and why representation, especially of Black women in elected office, is so essential to justice. I think everyone working in or around the criminal justice system can learn a lot from Sherry Boston. I definitely did in this interview, and I hope you enjoy the episode. First, tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your family, anything you're willing to share about your personal story, not related to your role as the DA in DeKalb County.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. My parents were high school sweethearts. And so, our family was very much rooted in faith, family, and community service. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a Vietnam vet that came home and went to work as a machinist. So they were what I call like your typical blue collar kind of couple, raising their family of two twin daughters in, the importance of hard work, giving back, and going to church. And that's kind of how I was raised. And that's what I knew. Both my parents spent most of their free time volunteering. My dad volunteered as a basketball coach in the recreational system in Baltimore, which is, a big thing. And he had the opportunity to work with a lot of kids in the city who didn't have father figures, and he helped guide them, many of whom went on to play in the NBA.
Do we know any of these players?
We do. I probably, shouldn't mention that. But
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So that's amazing. Okay, so go on about your father and sort of the service
he was
doing.
pretty, he was a pretty amazing person. He is a pretty amazing person. But, I grew up with my mom being like a leader in the church and a volunteer as, a counselor and to our youth group, and a dad who gave his free time to helping boys in the community that, he grew up in. So I think for me, and how it's framed for me, is that, my parents really put a foundation in me on how important it was to give back to the community in which you were raised. And to continue to help, kids that needed it. And my parents gave of themselves, their time, their energy, their money to always make sure that they were not only caring for us, but for the kids in their community and the people that they came up with. And that was pretty important to them. And they did all of that work in the community that they grew up in. So we would spend our weekends going into the city, because when my parents bought their first house, it was out in Baltimore County, which is where we went to school. But on weekends, when we went to church and when we were doing community service, all of that was back in the neighborhoods where my parents grew up. And so
was your home sort of in a suburban environment?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Our house was in the suburbs. We were the only Black family that lived on our street.
Wow.
The entire time I lived there up until I was 18, we were the only Black family that lived on that street. My parents still live in that same house. And now I think there are a couple other Black families, but growing up, it was just us, in this predominantly white neighborhood. But my parents felt like it was really important for us to grow up in the suburbs. And I think them both having been raised and living in the city, they just really wanted a different community for my sister and I specifically to go to school at.
And when you would go into the city for church or services, what was the demographics of the people who you were interacting with?
They were predominantly African-American communities. My parents both grew up in the Black community. Our church was an all-Black church. The community center that my dad taught basketball at, and eventually was where I had my first job at 13 years old, was in that community rec center. It was an all-Black community. Yeah.
And so what was it like having that split screen environment growing up? I mean, I'm assuming you went to an almost all-white school or an all-white school. And then on the weekends, you're going into the city with an all-Black community. So do you remember when you first became aware of that, or was it just...
Yeah, it was definitely a struggle for me and my sister, I would say, because, we went to school in the, 80s and 90s. And so it was very difficult to be at a school where there was very few kids that looked like you, and certainly not any teachers that looked like you. And, now, like, I can recount different experiences that my sister and I had, and how really protective my mom was of making sure that we were getting everything that we should get, and that we also weren't, my mom was going to make sure that we weren't marginalized, and she fought hard for that. So I spent most of my life in an environment that didn't look like me. There was no doubt in my mind that I wanted to go to college, in part because there was, it wasn't even a choice. It was something ingrained by my parents. My dad did not go to college. He went to a technical high school and then enlisted in the Army and volunteered for the war. And then came back and worked for the same company his entire life, right? My mom obviously went to college because she's a teacher. And so, but both my parents, it was just like, well, the reason that we are investing in this level of education for you by putting you in, like, it wasn't enough for us to live in a neighborhood that had a fairly good public school system. They felt it was important to, pinch every penny they had to send us to private Catholic school so that we could get an even better education.
Sherry went on to tell us that given her parents' strong emphasis on education, she always knew she'd go to some form of graduate school. And like a lot of people, she had a broad interest in the humanities, but wasn't exactly sure what career to pursue, so she went to law school. She quickly discovered a passion for criminal law and oral advocacy, which led her to an internship with the Georgia Indigent Defense Council, the state's public defender system at the time. Listen to Sherry talk about how that experience put her on the path to criminal defense, but eventually led her to prosecution. It's an interesting story, not just how she made the switch, but also why, after years on the defense side, she felt comfortable becoming a prosecutor. We talked about her move from Solicitor General to District Attorney in DeKalb County, and that story offers great insight into how a career path takes shape and how politics can influence the role.
So I worked for two people that are amazing, have been amazing people in my life and still work in the space of teaching and reform, which is Amy Maxwell and Michael Shapiro. And those two folks were my bosses. And I started working there my first year, my second semester of my first year in law school. And in that moment, I knew more than anything else, I wanted to defend people that had been accused of committing crimes. And you couldn't tell me anything else, including that I never wanted to be a prosecutor.
Right. So how does that's an easy next question. So how does that flip happen?
Oh, that flip happened after a decade, more than a decade, actually, about 12 years, because I loved what I did. I spent 12 years doing defense work and pro bono work and juvenile work and working with people that were accused of crimes, working with people that had substance abuse disorder, working with kids and adults that had challenging situations. And I loved everything about it. There was nothing that made me unhappy, and I had no desire to be a prosecutor. Never worked, never even interned in the prosecution office. Mm-hmm. But 12 years into my career, I started thinking about next steps, and a part of those next steps included thinking about becoming a judge. I'd gotten some part-time judicial positions that I worked at nights and weekends. And so I really thought I wanted to be a judge full-time. And so my first foray into elected office was actually running for a state court judge position in 2010. And, much longer story of what happened there, but we never got to an election because the judge decided to retire early, which meant it would be an appointment by the governor and no election. And so that's really what got me on the process of the appointment process and sort of getting on the radar of people. And so I decided to throw my name in the hat for the appointment process. I obviously did not get that job, right. But I had the opportunity to interview with the governor and the governor's executive council. And, I heard through the grapevine that I was a close second for that judgeship, and that the governor's people really liked me. But, this particular position was going to someone else, which was, for me, I was like, well, this is the first time I've ever gone through this process. Right. So I didn't have huge expectations. But it was after that, it was going through that process that ultimately, around that time, then President Obama had tapped the district attorney of DeKalb County, a woman by the name of Gwen Keyes Fleming, who was the first woman and the first African-American to serve as district attorney of DeKalb County. He tapped her to lead to a federal appointment to lead the EPA for the Southern district. And so she resigned from DA to accept a federal appointment with the president. And that started a domino. And so the then Solicitor General, Robert James, decided to run for district attorney. So he gave up his post as Solicitor General, which is the misdemeanor elected prosecutor. And then after that, I got a phone call. And oddly enough, the first phone call was, hey, do you want to run for district attorney in this special election? And I was like, why would I want to do that? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I've never been a prosecutor. And I was like, nah, I'm not interested in jumping out in this special election in the next 60 days. And I think people just thought, I'd already been running in the community and they were like, your name's already out there. I was like, nah, what qualifications do I have to be district attorney, right? And that's how I saw myself at that point. And so when I said no to that, they were like, okay, well, the solicitor is resigning to run for DA. What about that position? And that's not going to be an election. That actually, because of the way it all worked out, that's an appointment by the governor. And I said, well, I just interviewed with the governor and he didn't give me that last job. What makes you think he's going to give me this job? And there were folks around me that said, listen, you impress the governor. We think that you have a solid shot. So will you at least consider putting your name in the hat? And so it was, and let me just say this, the former Solicitor General, who happens to be one of my mentees, one of my mentors, pulled me aside and said, listen, Sherry, you've never done this job. You've never been a prosecutor, but I've done this job and I know you. And I know that A, not only will you be good at it, but B, I think you'll love it. And so I think you would be a fool not to put your name in the hat. And so she convinced me to do that. And I think it's important to say her name because she is now a justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Sean Ellen LaGrua. Sat me down in a table in a restaurant in Atlanta and said, this is what you got to do. And so I did. I put my name in. I interviewed with the governor. And on New Year's Eve of 2010, I got a phone call as I was loading both of my daughters into their car seats to go to the Science Museum. And I picked up my phone, a number I didn't recognize. And when I said hello, there was a woman on the other hand that said, please hold for the governor.
Oh, that's awesome. And for our listeners who aren't familiar with Georgia, this position, I'm sorry, it was Solicitor General, right? They handle misdemeanors, right? And then the DA in Georgia handles felonies. So not necessarily intuitive for all the listeners, but just want to clarify. So it's an elected prosecutor role. Yes. But handling the misdemeanor cases. But go on. So you got a call you're holding for the governor.
I'm holding for the governor. And the next thing I know, then Governor Sonny Perdue gets on the phone and says, Miss Boston, I'm hoping I can count on you. And I'm hoping that you can serve the citizens of DeKalb County well as the next Solicitor General of DeKalb County. And so I accepted that role that day. My first prosecution role was being offered to me to lead the office. And, it's not something I would have imagined 12 years before. But by the time I got to this moment, I felt like, okay, this is something I can do. And I'm very excited about the new journey ahead of me.
Right. And you haven't been explicit about it, but, you said as a law student mostly as a law student that, you would never consider being a prosecutor. So was there some kind of philosophical change? Was it almost like an ideological opposition to being a prosecutor in your law school days? Or was it more, tell us about sort of that mind shift and then, of course, the actual transition in being not just a prosecutor, but the elected prosecutor after being on the defense side for so long?
So I think if I really had to guess and think back, in a lot of ways in law school, it was an ideological thought, right? I went in when I decided I wanted to do criminal work and advocate for something. I really wanted to, I think for me, it was advocate for people that have been accused. Like I wanted to be on the side. And again, I think I also came into this really thinking that I would be in indigent defense, right? The idea of being a public defender and representing people that couldn't afford to hire the best lawyers in the country, right? You know what I mean? Like they didn't have money and they needed people that were going to work hard for them and give back. So I think that's where it started for me. And that's where I think my pull came from, which is being able to help people that needed help, right? With whatever they were going through and whatever their life circumstances were. And so when Justice LaGrua sat me down to talk to me about this job as Solicitor General, she said, Sherry, you've seen me do this job. I did this job. And she really felt like the passion that I had for helping people was translatable. She was like, first, you know, your ability to touch victims in this role is tremendous. And second, she really emphasized, and this is what I emphasize when I meet law students now going to law school and they're trying to make this decision between being a prosecutor and perhaps going into defense work or civil rights work. I say when I was working on the defense side, I had one client at a time, one case at a time. But being in this role allows me to make a decision and impact hundreds, if not thousands, with just that one decision. Right. And so understanding that led me to say, it's worth giving a try. And honestly, after being in defense work for 12 years, all around the state of Georgia, not just in one county. I tried cases all over the state of Georgia. I really got to see, like, okay, this county does this and that county does that and this circuit does this. And I said to myself, if I come and I get this job in DeKalb, I can take everything I know about what we could be doing and what we could be offering to people and make an impactful difference, not just for one client, but for everyone. So when I came in and was sworn in as solicitor, one of the very first things I wanted to implement was a wide swath of diversion programs. Mm-hmm. At that point, DeKalb County in the misdemeanor space had very few. And I was going to other places where I was like, you know, I have clients that are over here where I can get this type of program and it doesn't exist in DeKalb County. And so for me, it was this idea that I could really take everything I knew and create a space for not only supporting victims, but also for making sure that people got opportunities for second chances that I saw were working in other places because they had worked with clients that I had had. Mm-hmm. So in 2011, I was sworn in as Solicitor General, and that was the first time that I had been a prosecutor. And so I started this job in January, and the judgeship that I had not gotten out had just been decided, you know, maybe that September before. So this was a small swath of time. And so oddly enough, about, oh my gosh, it couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 weeks after I started as solicitor that not one, but two judgeships opened up in the same court that I had been, you know, put in for. And so there was kind of this back understanding that's like, well, man, if I hadn't taken this job, you know, if I was really next on the list,
oh my gosh,
I would have gotten the job. But and that's probably true. I would have, because two other people that were in the process with me ended up getting those jobs. But, you know, one thing I always say, and I repeat it, and I didn't make it up. I read it in an Oprah magazine, probably decades ago.
Please quote Oprah.
But I say it. I don't even know if it was Oprah that said it, but it was in O's magazine. Man's rejection is God's protection. And I firmly believe that man's rejection is God's protection, because the rejection of that job, which I thought was the bee's knees of what I wanted, became a protection. Mm-hmm. By moving me into this new role and giving me this new purpose, it didn't allow me to be available for that other job. And about a year after doing this job, I literally had a reckoning that this was where I was supposed to be. This was where I was meant to be all along. and that all the paths that I thought was leading me to a judgeship was actually leading me here to this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was about a year, almost 2 years into being solicitor, that I knew that I was going to run for district attorney. So I took myself back to that moment when I got that first phone call back in 2010 about running for district attorney, where I said, why would I ever want to do that? And then you fast forward a couple of years later, and in my head, I had been solicitor and I was enjoying being solicitor, but I was also looking at my community and recognizing that there was more that I knew I wanted to do. And that role did not give me the opportunity to tap in to do all the things I wanted to do. And frankly, I also felt like the person sitting in that seat couldn't do the job as good as I could. And so when I turned down the opportunity to be considered for this position, there were people that called me up and said, hey, we heard you've been getting calls about this position. There's only one reason that you would say no. And I said, what's that? They're like, you're going to run for district attorney someday. And I didn't confirm or deny,
Right.
but the answer was in fact true.
Yeah.
Because I knew that I was at a fork in the road. And if I wanted to continue on this journey, if I wanted to run for district attorney, if I wanted to be DA, then I had to continue down this path and learn and grow and advocate so much more until I felt that I was ready to step out there and do it. And then in 2015, I made the decision that I wasn't going to wait for the DA to leave or to do what they wanted to do next, that I was going to run and I was going to challenge him for his seat. And I did just that. And I won with 62% of the vote. Which
On an incumbent.
On an incumbent, which in Georgia really just didn't happen. Incumbents didn't get opposition in district attorneys races, and they didn't lose. I don't do things because they're easy.
Okay, we talked a lot about Sherry's career path, but I wanted to share that part of the interview because it's powerful to hear how her early childhood shaped her and how her views on making an impact in the criminal justice system changed over time. We then shifted to how being a Black woman has influenced her perspective and her role as DA. Listen as Sherry reflects on what was going through her mind when she was sworn in, and how her identity continues to shape the way she leads and seeks justice in her office.
So as I stood there being sworn in, I was at that time the only Black woman serving as district attorney in the state of Georgia. Not the first, but the only serving at that time. And so to me, in that moment, it was a realization that, I was in a different space. And outside of those two other Black men, there was a third one that won the same year as I did. So the other three, the rest of the district attorneys at that time were primarily white men. We've gotten obviously more white females and a significantly larger number of Black females since I first came in. But I can remember standing in that large hall giving that speech and just thinking in that moment, all the things along my life. I mean, obviously, there were many times that I was the first or the only. That was not new to my experience, as we've talked about my high school experience. And so it was another moment for me where I had to think about what voice do I have to lend to offer in this space that might not be heard if I were not here. And that's how I view it. And so absolutely, I think my experience as a Black woman, as a mother, as a wife, as someone who was raised in different communities than perhaps other people, I think lived experience 100% is going to inform how you do this job. And for hundreds of years, this job was done by primarily and almost exclusively white men. And so the opportunity to come in and bring my experiences, which are vastly different, to the table and to this chair and in this seat, is an opportunity to have a viewpoint and a vantage point that is wildly different. And that doesn't even touch on the fact that I was a defense attorney or a judge and all of those other things. But each and every single one of those experiences has framed my viewpoint from this seat. And that's why I find it immensely important for us to bring people into these roles that can 100% bring a different viewpoint, vantage point, and lived experience point to this role and to communities that are not monolithic and that are very diverse. You know, these are communities that we represent. And I think what's very important to me is that communities have representation that look like them. And so it is and remains a priority for me to have an office that is reflective of our community. And that people working in this office reflect that. And that means there should be judges in the courtroom that look like the people that they can identify with. There should be public defenders in the courtroom that reflect the community. And there certainly should be prosecutors that reflect the community. And so that goes down to something that is very important to me, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? And that space is important. And so for me, having a diverse staff and having implicit bias training in our office as a backbone of how we do the work, to respect the victims that we serve from diverse communities, and for us to respect the people that we are charging with crimes with that same level of diversity in our community. I don't know that anyone before me ever contemplated the necessity and importance of that in this office. And so for me, I view that as a lasting legacy that hopefully whoever comes behind me will continue to uphold and uplift. And it's those types of things that I think are very different than, say, my white male counterparts when they're thinking about how they staff and how they view their offices.
So still talking about the fact that there are so few Black prosecutors, has there ever been a dynamic where Black relatives or friends or even constituents are questioning why you'd want to be a prosecutor, given the fact that Black people have historically faced unfair treatment and oppression within our criminal justice system?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say I've been really lucky that my family's been, for the most part, primarily supportive. Although I've had one or two family members that have been like, you're contributing to the system and the man, right? That's going to happen. And it is a difficult challenge, I think, in part for prosecutors of color, right? Because they understand and have family members that have been prosecuted unfairly throughout history under this idea of the systemic racism that has existed in society and the over-policing that we've seen. And, and for those of us, I am a descendant of slavery, right? And so I know what my family history is, and I know how law enforcement was used against my ancestors, right? And so when you have those experiences and you know that there are going to be people that are feeling those very real things, and oftentimes they question why you're doing what you're doing. I can remember very vividly where I think I saw more Black prosecutors struggling when George Floyd was murdered. It was in that moment that I know for me, I even questioned, is this the system I want to be a part of? And I remember sending out an email to the prosecutors that identify as African American in my office, saying, well, I sent a message to everybody about the case and how we were feeling, but I sent a separate email in addition to those staff where I said, I know you're hurting, and you're hurting in a different kind of way because you are seeing this murder, and it is invoking a lot of other feelings that perhaps other people aren't having. And I want you to know that I'm not okay, and it's okay if you're not okay, because it hurts to watch these things over and over on video. And so it's really important that we understand. And so I feel for, and I know because I've heard from them, Black prosecutors that perhaps are the only one in their offices, right? And I've lived that only one life in school. So I know how isolating that can be. But when you're the only one in a prosecution office, and you feel those eyes staring at you, or you feel like people talking behind your back, or you feel like people want you to be the voice of, what are we supposed to, you're the expert on Blackness because you're the only Black person we know. To be in those spaces and in those experiences are, insulting, offensive, isolating, hurtful. I mean, I could use the words over and over again. So I think it's so important to create spaces that allow people to want to do this work and stay in this work. And so I've had people come to work for me that have recounted stories of being the one Black prosecutor in the office and how that elected made them feel in those moments where it's like everybody in the room just turns and say, well, let's hear what the Black person has to say, right? Nobody wants to be that. Nobody should be that. And so to create a space and to be in a space, and for me to have an understanding of what it feels like personally, and not only that, opening up a space for people to feel like they can have conversations. I think that's important.
It's definitely important. I'm curious what you told yourself to keep going when George Floyd was murdered, and if we had a Black law student who's thinking about prosecution, or even thinking, I still don't understand how Sherry Boston is a DA given the historical role of the criminal justice system in the Black communities across this country. I don't want to say how do you justify doing the work, but I mean, I guess I can't think of a better way to phrase it. Why do you keep doing this work, given all of its flaws and the racial nature of it?
So I will say I struggled mightily when George Floyd was murdered. That was a really difficult time. And in a lot of ways, I put on a mask for sure with my staff because, I was also in this position of you can't let them see you break, right? And I was broken. I mean, we were all in code for a lot of reasons. We were isolated. I was at home. My staff was at home. I was broken. I was struggling. I was not in a great place. But you learn so much to just put the mask on and keep it moving. That's what we've been doing as Black women all of our lives, right? All our history has told us that we don't have time to break. So it was the safety and comfort of my other Black female DAs that really became that safe space for me to just say, I'm not okay. And none of us were okay. But what do I say to those folks of, why bother? Why do this? Why put myself in this space? Every day I say to myself, and I would say to this law student, is that if we aren't in the space doing this work and sharing our experiences, then no one will be. And there can't be systemic change, and there can't be advancement if we aren't here. Because if we aren't doing this work, and let me just say who we is, if Black women aren't doing this work, it's not happening. In so many ways, it did not start happening until Black women were elected into these roles across the country. And we started taking the body blows to do what needed to be done. And then as a result of that, you see a lot of people coming behind us, and there's a lot of amazing white women and men that are doing the work. But it was Black women whose shoulders that they are standing on in many, many places if you look across the country. When I think about the Kim Foxes of the world, right? And the Kim Gardners and the Marilyn Mosbys, all of those people were brave to do the work as firsts and to make really hard, unpopular decisions that people copied, emulated, and continued on even after they have left those roles.
What's interesting is that at this point in the interview, I had actually planned to pivot, to ask Sherry about her large range of leadership roles, both in Georgia and nationally. From her work in DeKalb County to her involvement in the lawsuit challenging Georgia's Prosecutor Oversight Commission, she's doing a lot. So I asked her why she does it. Why does she do so much beyond run a prosecutor's office in a single county? And her response brought us back to the issue of race. For Sherry, it's not just about representation, it's about responsibility. As a Black woman in spaces where voices like her are often absent, she feels a deep obligation to speak up and shape the systems that can really change people's lives. Let's talk about the fact that you are so active far beyond the community that you serve, you taking an hour and a half of your time to do this podcast as an example. You're heavily involved in your state DA's association, multiple national organizations for prosecutors. You've been incredibly supportive, and I'm grateful of that, of my work here at Vanderbilt. I think every time I've had a conference, you've showed up. And so I'm just curious, why do you invest so much time in participating in statewide organizations, national organizations? Do you think that benefits your community directly? Or do you see these activities beyond DeKalb as part of your job for a different reason?
So I think it's really a part of my personality. I've always been involved in a lot of organizations. When I was a defense attorney, I was involved in a lot of national organizations. When I was in college, I was involved in a lot of organizations. So first and foremost, I think it's just me. Right? It's who I am. But I will say there was definitely a shift from when I was solicitor to DA. I think when I was solicitor, I was very focused on the importance of really what is happening in my community and what is happening in the Georgia prosecution world. When I became DA, I suddenly realized, I think I stopped blocking out the noise and realized that there was a lot more around me to be gained and learned. And I also started to realize that the ideas that I had and wanted to work out and wanted to hear and learn from other people were not going to happen in Georgia. There just wasn't enough of that. And so realizing that there were people that were looking at it the way I did, and even in ways that I hadn't been exposed to yet, I saw it as a great opportunity to first learn. I think I can remember that first year being invited places, and I would go and I wouldn't speak. I would just listen. because the rooms were filled with people that I admired, books and articles that I'd read, experts that had, from this academic or done this role. And I was just like, oh, I'm going to drink this all in. And it's my responsibility to learn as much as possible. And somewhere along the way, it's when other people sometimes shine a mirror in front of your own face that you genuinely realize that you have some things to offer, and you start to share. And so from there, my sharing became, okay, well, I have a voice to lend. And so if I'm going to be in this role and in this job, I'm not just going to sit in my office here in DeKalb. I'm going to make sure that I'm offering this perspective anywhere I have the opportunity to be in the room and share that perspective. Because there's only a handful of us and we can't be everywhere all the time. So it's like, we got to spread out, right?
And when you say us, are you talking about Black female DAs?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I do. I mean, I just think that it became obvious to me that it was important for our voices to be in every space possible, and to continue to help reframe, rebuild, and transform. And so I can't do that just by being here. I had to also be engaged in other spaces. So when organizations ask me to come to a panel or ask me to come speak at a law school or ask me to be a part of something, or researching an idea or thinking through an idea or, giving my thoughts and opinions, I view that as an important part of the legacy that I want to leave, because obviously I want to leave a huge legacy here, but I want to have the opportunity to say that I touched on other spaces that otherwise would benefit from hearing what's happening in a place like DeKalb, and how we're doing it, and maybe like it be replicated in other places, and have influence for those communities, which is also equally important.
In 2023, Sherry and 3 other Georgia DAs sued to block a state law that threatens to remove elected prosecutors. The case is now in discovery and headed for a hearing, with the Georgia Supreme Court likely to weigh in. Here's Sherry explain why this fight matters to prosecutors, not just in Georgia, but all over the country.
Well, I was really passionate about, let me just back up and say, I started really fighting just the legislation a number of years ago, dating back to 2020, in part because I felt it trampled on prosecutor discretion and independence, which is the backbone of doing this job, is having the independence to make decisions about what is right and the discretion to implement them. And prosecutor independence and discretion is not a new thing. It is absolutely what we have, a power that we have given the person elected to the seat for the hundreds of years that prosecutors have been doing it. But what we have seen is a backlash on prosecutors who have now chosen to use their independence and discretion to oftentimes protect their communities from what they may view as unnecessary prosecutions, or laws that they think are harmful to their community. And so I've always said, over time, many of our rights and freedoms have been born out of criminal prosecutions that ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court has halted. And so when you think about things like Loving versus Virginia or Roe v. Wade and its progeny during its time, these were all cases, criminal cases, where prosecutors were willing to prosecute people that married outside of their race, or willing to prosecute people for having abortions at a time, right? And so those prosecutors were willing to do it, and that's how those cases reached the Supreme Court. But what we are seeing now is prosecutors that are saying, hey, I don't think that prosecution serves the best interest of my community. And so I'm going to use my prosecutor discretion to not prosecute that particular case under that fact pattern or that scenario. And now we have folks that are saying they don't like that. They don't want prosecutors to make decisions using their discretion if, in fact, their viewpoint is not aligned with what they think should be happening. And what we know is in these communities, these folks have been elected by their community on platforms where they've been honest about what they think is important to prosecute and what they think is not. And the communities have said, yes, this is who we want. And now we have people that want, outside of those communities generally, that want to override the will of the people and remove those people because they think they are not doing the job for which they were elected to do.
And what do you say to the idea that a local elected DA like yourself shouldn't be able to just nullify a law that was passed by a state legislature that is also voted by the will of the people and signed by the governor?
I say that every day there are laws on the books that we choose not to prosecute, either A, because it is no longer the standard for which our community would accept, or because we don't have the resources. Here today in Georgia, on the books, a law that has not been repealed and could be repealed, it remains a crime to commit adultery. And tomorrow, I would not prosecute a member of my community if someone came down to the courthouse and asked for there to be a warrant issued against their spouse for adultery. But the law is clear. It is a crime in the state of Georgia to commit adultery. But it is my discretion not to prosecute that case and ultimately not to use the resources of my office to prosecute that case.
Is it relevant that the adultery law was passed in, I don't even know what decade, whereas things like the abortion laws were passed within the last 5 years?
No, I don't think it's relevant at all. I don't think it matters because, I mean, we know for a fact that in many states, if we're talking about abortion, in many states, when Roe fell, there were states whose laws reverted back to laws that were passed in the 1900s. So not passed during local modern times, but now that's the law in those states, right? Immediately. So I don't think it matters. What I would say when people say that to me, well, that law is, we don't really, we don't do anything with that law. I said, but it hasn't been repealed.
And is your approach, Sherry, we've had DAs come on this show to say, I have a policy where I just will not, I will not prosecute X crime. Actually, I don't think anyone's come on the show to say that, but there are DAs out there who have said we will not, as a policy, ever prosecute these cases. And then there are some that try to take a more nuanced approach and say, I'm generally not going to prosecute, but I will look at every single case. And so I'm curious, do you take the former approach on any particular categories of crime, or do you generally say, I'm not going to focus a lot on, say, marijuana, but I will look at them at least to see if there's a reason to prosecute?
So we have over time had policies. I mean, we had a COVID backlog policy during COVID about which cases we were prioritizing and not prioritizing. And, obviously I put out a statement well before Roe fell about how I felt about the Georgia heartbeat bill, because let's keep in mind that in Georgia, when our legislature passed the Georgia heartbeat bill criminalizing abortions, Roe was still the law of the land. So they wrote a law that was contrary to what the law of the land was. And so at that time, I was very clear that I believed that there were protections in place, and that it would not be a violation of the law to have an abortion in Georgia, despite the fact that the legislature had written a law that said so. But Roe fell, right? But what I have said to my community is, and this is how I feel about any case, I live in a community where I understand that the prosecution of violent crime is the number one priority of this office. Murders, armed robberies, rape, child molestation, people that are a harm to commit additional violent felonies against people in my community are my number one priority. And they will always remain my number one priority. Everything else is secondary to me. And that's how we look at cases in my office 100% of the time. Does this person that you've accused of committing this particular crime pose a threat to others in the community by the actions that they are taking or the actions that they intend to take? And that's the priority. Or do we have cases where it's against the law to possess, it's a felony to possess even, a personal amount of use of drugs in the state of Georgia? But I have to ask myself, is incarcerating someone for that offense going to help resolve the problem and protect the community? Probably not.
I guess my question is, does your office even look at those cases, say a case that's a crime under the new abortion law or the tiny amount of, I'm sorry, which drug was it? Did you say cocaine?
It's any drug.
Any drug. Or is it just they don't even come into your office because law enforcement and judges know?
Yeah. And here as I sit in 2025 to date, we have never received a referral from any law enforcement agency, local or state, that is alleged a crime related to abortion. We just haven't. Okay. We just haven't. Now we've seen a couple of scenarios where law enforcement has gone out for stillbirths and miscarriages. But the law enforcement agencies, upon that review, have made those determinations that there's nothing to see here, right? If a case like that came into my office, we're going to look at the facts and circumstances 100%, and make a determination if we believe a violation of the law has, one, happened, and B, if that case is prosecutable or should be prosecuted.
Right.
And we do that every day.
I found Sherry's answer about abortion cases really interesting. She said she would examine such a case, but it seemed likely she wouldn't prosecute it, given her clear focus on prioritizing violent crime. And that highlights an important nuance. While reform-minded prosecutors are often criticized for quote-unquote decriminalizing entire categories of offenses, many, like Sherry, still believe in reviewing each case individually. If you haven't heard our interview with Larry Krasner, he takes a similar approach. He evaluates all cases but operates with the presumption against prosecuting certain offenses like prostitution. Finally, as promised, we have our first You Ask the Questions segment. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions, and please keep them coming, whether it's for a future guest, a question you have about a prosecution you've read about, or anything else. We've got two questions from our listeners. I'm going to read this one verbatim. This person wrote in anonymously, "I've always wanted to ask this, especially in Georgia, where many African American communities are closely knit and social media often reveals unexpected ties. How does your office handle situations where there may be familial or social media connections between prosecutors, law enforcement, or even judges and individuals involved in a case? Are there systems in place to screen for potential conflicts?
So the short answer is absolutely yes. Every prosecution office, I think, no matter where you go, in DeKalb, African-American communities, Hispanic communities, white communities, what have you, will always and should always have a system in place to screen out for any conflicts. But I will say, in a place like DeKalb, conflicts are much fewer and far between than places in smaller communities, because in smaller communities, people tend to know all of their neighbors and all go to the same restaurant and perhaps all went to the same high school. So we don't face this level of intense familiarity in a place like DeKalb County because we're a much bigger constituency. We're a constituency of about, over 800,000 residents. You get to a smaller community, that might have 10,000 residents and everybody knows each other. So, but the reality of it is conflicts will happen. We will have people in my office that are victims of crime. We'll have people in my office who have family members that are charged with crimes. And so there is a process for us to look for those conflicts and to remove ourselves from those cases. And in the case where, someone that I'm close to or someone that I have ties to is a victim or accused of a crime, we would also conflict out of those cases. So it is something that is normal course for us. And we constantly remind our staff that they have a duty and responsibility to share if someone that they're close to or someone in their family is connected to a case that's in our office, to give us the opportunity to evaluate whether that would rise to a conflict that requires us to find another office to handle that case.
Great. And the second question that we picked from our listeners, this also came in anonymously, is do you think the progressive prosecutor movement, this is an intense question, do you think the progressive prosecutor movement bears any responsibility for the backlash we see against criminal justice reform? If you could go back in time, is there anything you would do differently as someone who has advocated for big change in our justice system, or do you wish some of your counterparts had done anything differently?
Wow, that is a very loaded question.
Yeah, I saved it for the end.
But here's what I'll say. I don't think that the progressive prosecutor movement bears any responsibility. I think the movement was highlighting things that were already in need of change. People were already talking about these issues, but now you had prosecutors that were willing to really examine, talk about, and implement change. I will say that if I could encourage and go back and do something different, we all would. And what I would say is that I think the other side, the people that I think wanted to blame progressive prosecutors for the criminal justice reform, did a really good job with messaging. And they got out in front and messaged really dis and misinformation about what reform was doing with public safety. And they did a really good job of messaging that reform equals not safe. When there is no data, I don't think anyone can show me a study that makes that correlation, because it doesn't exist. In fact, there's plenty of data that has been done by amazing research institutions like Vanderbilt and other academic institutions that have looked at this and partnered to look at the data that shows that many of the issues and areas where we've had criminal justice reform has actually meant the opposite, that it has made those communities more safe because in part, and I will say it's the prime example, is one of the reasons communities aren't safe is because there are lots of people in communities that don't trust prosecutors and don't trust law enforcement, and so are unwilling to be witnesses, to testify and give information about the things that they're seeing in their community. They would rather risk the violence sometimes in their communities because they don't trust that they can be protected or believed or treated well by the people that they would have to share that information with. Let that sink in, right? That's you have that choice, and the choice you make is to remain silent when you are seeing things that are harmful to your community. So I firmly believe that where we have gone wrong is we just didn't get out ahead in the messaging. We didn't have the opportunity to frame the truth before others had the opportunity to name the distruth and what criminal justice reform really meant for communities and public safety.
And I know I'm putting you on the spot, but what would that message be? Or what is that message, right? It's not like criminal justice reform is dead. What is that message then?
Oh, it's absolutely that there is no community has to make a choice between criminal justice reform and holding violent offenders accountable. And that is my message in DeKalb every day. Every day, we are prosecuting people for serious violent felonies. And every day, I have attorneys going into courtrooms and asking to send people to prison for life because we believe those people are a true danger to the community. But at the same time, we are an office that every day recognizes that not every person needs to go to prison. Not every person needs a felony conviction. That not every crime that happens needs to be prosecuted. And that we are engaged in reform that's meant to make our community trust us more, understand that there have been systemic systems of racism within our community that have absolutely led to the unfair prosecution of certain people. But I can say all of those things, and they don't have to be two separate things. Right. And too often we have people that say, well, if you're not law and order, then you are a prosecutor that's not doing their job and not making their community safe. And that simply is not only the wrong message, it's a lie. Because I can tell you this, I've met a lot of prosecutors, conservative, liberal, law and order, progressive, you pick a title. I have never met a prosecutor that took over an office and said, you know what? I'm not prosecuting anybody. Name one, because they don't exist. What does exist are elected prosecutors that want to make sure they are serving their community well, serving their community right, holding people accountable, but also understanding that the system sometimes unfairly targets certain parts of their community. And they want to make sure that they do everything in their power to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Sherry's right. That last question was a really loaded one, but I had to ask it. While she may not label herself a progressive prosecutor, many of her public statements and policies reflect the core concerns of some of those prosecutors. That prosecution has too often prioritized convictions and long sentences over addressing root causes, that communities of color are disproportionately and unfairly targeted, and that racial equity must be a central concern in our justice system. And she's right again. One of the biggest missteps among reform-minded prosecutors, at least in my view, has been responding defensively to the false choice between public safety and fairness. Sherry makes a powerful case for rejecting that binary. As she explains, a more just system doesn't undermine safety, it enhances it. Because when people lose faith in our system, they stop cooperating, and violent crimes go unsolved or under-prosecuted. And her clarity on this point is really what we need more of in this moment. True Bill Talk is produced by Carrie Hayes from Coeo Strategies, Colin Nixon, and me, Alyssa Haydari. Many thanks to DA Sherry Boston for coming on the show and sharing so much about her personal background, her career, and her views on prosecution. If you want to email me a question, you have an idea for a future episode, or even want to just send me your reaction to this episode, you can email me or drop a voice note at alyssa.haydari@vanderbilt.edu. That's ALISSA.HEYDARI@vanderbilt.edu. And you can also call 615-343-3826 and leave a voicemail. We might feature it in the podcast. Thank you, and now go do justice.